welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. With the housing market heating up year over year, many homeowners are excited for the increase in valuation to their properties. But what if you're trying to get into the market and not cash out? With the average Canadian home above $816,000, the likelihood of owning a home seems more out of reach than ever before. But why does it have to be this way? Can't builders just build more homes? Well, enter zoning regulations and local standards. These regulations can be so stringent that many builders and property owners simply throw up their hands in frustration. Why even bother if the local government just makes it so difficult? Well, recently, the Ontario government charged the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force, created to address the housing crisis, to devise solutions. The result? Ontario needs 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years. And how should we get there? By tackling municipalities who act as the gatekeepers. Later in the program, I will be joined by Popolo, founder of an Ontario-based land development firm, Popolo Corp. Inc. But now I'd like to introduce Peter Shawn Taylor, senior features editor at C2C Journal, and David Clement, North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center and a regular contributor here on Counterpoint. Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining me. So I think I'm going to start with you, David, because you and I have had some banter about housing before. So just how big is the housing crisis in Canada?
It's hard to explain, but the numbers will do some justice. So average home prices in January across the country rose 20% from 2021. So in British Columbia, you're looking at over $1 million. In Ontario, you're looking at close to $1 million. We're seeing a very rapid increase in the price to buy a home, and that's also impacting renters across the country, where in major metropolitan cities like Toronto or Vancouver, you need about $130,000 in income to be able to reasonably afford a two-bedroom apartment. But the problem is that in those major cities, the average family income across all families is around $60,000 to $70,000. And so there's a huge gap. It's getting worse. And there couldn't be a better time for us to focus on building more homes and to target zoning reform.
Right, and I should apologize because in my opener I didn't even address the renting crisis. But you're right, as the cost of homes go up, so too does the rent. And when we have low supply, it can just all exacerbate the situation. So I guess, Peter, does Canada have a chronic undersupply issue?
Oh, certainly. You look at comparisons of OECD countries. Canada is, I think, among the G7, it's the lowest in terms of how many houses per capita. And across Canada as well, there's quite a diversity in how many houses the provinces are building. Ontario is one of the poorest sort of housed provinces in terms of how many houses they're building for how many people are coming in. So certainly certain provinces where the where the house prices are going up the fastest are the ones that do the worst job of building more houses, and on an international basis, Canada appears to be underhoused. Certainly our supply isn't keeping track with the way other countries are managing it.
And for you, David, I mean, you're a millennial. You're, I think, trying to crack into the market. How would an increase in supply impact you?
So an increase in supply would create what a lot of housing critics talk about, which is the missing middle. So if I think to even my sister's generation, who's about 10 years older than me, it was very feasible to have a starter home, live in that until you have children, and kind of move up the housing ladder along the way. Because of the way in which we have really fed the housing crisis and the undersupply issue, more often than not, you have very, very small condos available to those maybe first entering the market. You have almost nothing in the middle, so nothing you would raise a young family in. And then you have very, very expensive freehold single-family homes that are, I mean, if you look in the GTA, we're looking 1.3, 1.6, $1.8 million, which are virtually impossible to save for unless you have generational wealth.
I'm going to pause you there. We're going to cut to commercial. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing Canada's housing crisis, and joining me is Peter Shawn Taylor and David Clement. David, before the commercial, we were saying how hard it is to crack into the market, even in the rental market, unless you mentioned have generational wealth. What is that, and how are you seeing that being applied to people trying to get in?
Yeah, generational wealth, the best way to describe it would be cash from mom and dad. The average gift, I think, right now in Ontario for those who've had their parents help them out is probably about $180,000.
Wow.
If you don't have that, and I fall into that category, that is a huge mountain to climb. Think about the amount of money you need to save to get to a down payment on $1 million home. You're looking at over $100,000. That is incredibly difficult, especially when economically job prospects are not, we are not in booming times per se. Wages have not kept pace with the increase in housing, and so housing is getting more expensive, and incomes and wages are not nearly keeping pace with it.
So, Peter, you recently published an article, actually both of you recently did, but Peter, you wrote an article where you were talking about, about this housing shortage, which obviously therefore with the low supply, forces the cost of the existing supply upwards to obviously the detriment of those wanting to get in. How would loosening zoning regulations help alleviate some of this shortage of supply?
Sure. Well, that housing affordability task force that you mentioned in Ontario, they zeroed right in on municipal zoning and urban design and approval processes as the major, as you said, gatekeeper for all this. Zoning will take them one by one. Zoning prevents certain types of housing being built in certain areas. The task force said that 70% of Toronto is set aside for single and semi-detached housing, which prevents what David was talking about, the missing middle, fourplexes and walk-ups and different varieties of things that can be infilled in existing areas if it's becoming more and more difficult to build new suburbs. So if you're going to find land to put more houses, you're going to where is it going to happen? And infill is certainly an obvious place to start. So any kind of zoning that says you can't build something here is going to get in the way of any effort at increasing supply. And then once you've dealt with zoning, then you've got all things like urban design standards, you got shadow rules, you got tree studies, you got all sorts of things, and then the approval process. How much say do neighbors have in what is going to go up on the corner? Is it going to be a missing middle type thing with a little more density than a single family home? So all these hoops you got to jump through, all these gates you got to enter, all work to restrict supply, and that's the big problem that the task force zeroed in on.
Now, you brought up an interesting point that sometimes you have to negotiate with your neighbors if you want to, put an addition on and you want extra space, or in this case, if you maybe take down a single family home and put in a semi or two semis, there's sometimes a lot of resistance, a lot of NIMBYism, not in my backyard-ism. David, how prevalent is that? And do you think, for example, in Ontario, that there's an appetite to loosening these laws? Do you think Ontarians are going to welcome that?
I think so how big is the problem? It's huge. Where I live in Oakville, residents, in my opinion, misguidingly opposed the sale of a golf course, which would have built 3,400 units of all shapes and sizes, because they particularly really like this golf course, although less than 1% of people in the town have probably ever played on it. This happens across the board in every major Canadian city. How much of there is an appetite for it? Well, as voting demographics change, as millennials become the boomers in the context of those you need to seek votes from, I think that this conversation will continue to develop in favor of those who are calling for these changes, because when we're the group who represents the most votes, well, what's the number one issue for folks like me? It's housing.
So what drives, okay, you mentioned this golf course. They didn't want to, pave paradise and put up some semis. What drives that? Sentimentality?
I think it's this really strange idea that you get to determine what someone else can do with their property. So that golf course is owned by a company. The company wants to sell the land and wants to develop it. At the end of the day, as much as I'm a passionate golfer and I am one of the few people who've played on that golf course, it's not mine.
Welcome back. I'm now joined by Paul Popolo, founder of an Ontario-based land development firm, Polo Corp. Inc. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm excited to delve into more of the mechanics, if you will, of development and why perhaps some of the zoning regulations are causing or exacerbating the housing crisis we have. So how does the housing development process, or even the state of housing, differ from, say, 40 years ago in your experience?
Well, I think there's two probably major factors. One is the timing to get approval. And it's taken in the 70s and 80s, I recall it would take you anywhere from about a year and a half on average to get any approvals for a residential land development. Nowadays, in the 2022 move forward, it takes you anywhere to 3 to 5 years plus to get any approvals for residential land development in Ontario.
Wow, so that's a lot of carrying cost, and really, I can only imagine
Yes.
a very large developer could carry such costs. Those who are starting to do infill development with a few units here and there, that would be out of reach for them.
Well, I think, in the 70s, I recall in my days of practice, we had a lot of small builders, small little independent builders that would be able to handle this. And nowadays, because the costs, we're talking millions of dollars for a lot of these municipal studies that are required, whether it be a tree management plan, a stormwater management plan, a subdivision plan, all of those various studies require time and effort. And now it takes literally millions. So the major corporations are the only ones that can afford to get involved in the land development business in the 2022.
Now, you mentioned a plethora of plans and, I guess, sign-offs you require to get a shovel into the ground before you build, and you said this takes perhaps anywhere between 3 and 5 years. Let's talk about some of those things. You mentioned, a tree. Maybe you need an urban study, probably traffic as well. And what does that mean?
Studies, well, it just means time. I think one of the major arguments that I've been hearing is that local standards are a barrier, such as heritage designation, buffer zone, tree management plan, engineering, traffic studies, noise studies, stormwater management. But those are all good urban design regulation to balance both the public and the private. That but what has happened in the process is the timing for obtaining approvals and the scoping of the studies needs to be really revisited in the planning profession. Because number one, it's taking too long for the approvals. And number two, the scopes of studies are really getting out of hand, and they should really be focused on those. So I don't think anybody's arguing that, the barriers like the urban standard should be removed. I'm not an advocate of that. However, they need to be balanced both from a timing and the scoping of the work.
So why if these studies sort of always existed, why has the process become so protracted now? Is it just increased bureaucracy? Is there more civilian interest and perhaps engagement with these developments?
I think it's twofold. Number one is I think we need to streamline the planning, the public input into the process. I recall in the 70s and 80s, you'd have maybe one meeting with the residents, 2 meetings. Now it's not uncommon to have 10, 15 meetings. And that's where a lot of the developers and builders get frustrated and then refer it to the LPAT tribunal to have an independent hearing just because of the timing required to get all these things. So that's number one. And number two, I think the scope of this study, the process really needs to be streamlined. There should be more effective studies, and the timeline, like I said, for approvals need to be reviewed and somewhat truncated to make it more manageable for approvals.
So if you're, say, not a large developer and you're just a homeowner and you have a single detached home and you say, you know what, I don't need all this house. Why don't I redevelop this property and put two semis on it and make 2 units? I can rent out one and live in the other half. Would a resident face this kind of 3 to 5 year delay potentially?
Under the current rules, they probably would.
Wow.
But if the inclusionary zoning was to be implemented today, which would include all single family housing units. So behind me, I just wanted to show you an example. If the rules were changed to allow semis, singles, townhouses, and stacked houses that are behind me, this is the form of housing that would go into the single family zoning categories throughout the municipalities.
Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're joined again by Paul Popolo, and we're discussing what can happen to alleviate this housing crisis and what practical solutions could happen here in Ontario, for example. Paul, before the commercial break, we were discussing how changes to the zoning laws, how there could be many changes and many restrictions lifted to allow more infill development, to allow more housing, not just supply, but also options within that supply. I know, for example, there are many seniors who love their neighborhood, want to stay in their neighborhood, but they just don't want to maintain a single detached family dwelling any longer. But there might not be anything that either a townhouse or a low-rise or mid-rise even condo units. What could happen to kind of help? Why is that important, and what could we do to help stimulate that kind of supply?
Well, I'm a big advocate of the need for inclusionary zoning to fix what is referred to as the missing middle for all zoning categories, especially single family categories. So this would allow for, to your point, this would allow, for example, seniors that have an existing home to build a coach house, to build another small attached unit, accessory unit, to maybe put a townhouse or even a stacked, assuming you've got, which is behind me, sorry, to allow for more residential units to be built. So this would allow the millennials who are living in the basements often, or living in one of the units, to have their own independent unit adjacent to mom and dad or grandma and grandpa, and create a more vibrant community and really address a lot of the problems that we have right now with the affordable housing issues in Ontario and Canada.
Because the Ontario, the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force did say that if we want to solve this, or at least make a huge dent into this problem, we need to build 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years. And that's a lot of housing.
That is a lot of housing. Now, the other communities, such as New Zealand, just apparently passed the same sort of inclusionary zoning in single family areas. They're off and running. California has done it. New Jersey has done it. So there are a lot of good examples throughout Canada, the US, and overseas of developments of this nature.
Wow. So, perhaps we won't be that far down the path if there is a desire, if there is a will. So some people might hear what you're saying and say, but, I want to maintain the character of my neighborhood. This is why I bought into this neighborhood. How can that desire be satisfied if we switch to an all-inclusive zoning model?
And that's a very fair question. I think these units can be incorporated into an existing community through proper planning. For example, maintaining tree cover, setbacks, all these sort of regulations that are normally applicable to a normal unit. So we're not advocating bringing a 10-story building in a single family area, but we're advocating for, low rise that is sort of attainable and meets good urban design in the community.
Now, there's something called, they call it the as of right revolution. Why has that gained popularity? What is it and why has it gained popularity lately?
I think what's happened with the planning profession and people's rights for land is we've gone completely over on one end. And I think we need to go back to a proper balance in the middle. And so that is why you're getting a lot of pressure. Well, number one, because housing prices have tripled. Affordability is a critical thing. That if you look at the polls right now in both election polls, the number one issue is affordability and the cost of living. So and then climate is, guess what? Climate is number 3 and 4, and the environment. So this is a very important and hits to the heart of a lot of the people. Like a lot of people are maintaining their millennium kids at home.
Right.
Because they can't afford to buy a house. They can't put a down payment of, $100,000 or $200,000, depending on the type of home that you're purchasing. So there is that whole struggle of affordability, which is really this as of right has been gaining momentum. And I know that the Toronto Board of Trade, was also advocating the whole thing about the need for inclusionary zoning. And it's too bad that it wasn't implemented. Maybe it will be implemented by the Ford government, in the short term.
Okay, Paul, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for your insights, and we're going to definitely keep an eye on this topic in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.